And so now Obama talks more about the war in Afghanistan, and specifically he talks more about Robert Gates. And so he's got lots of great things to say about Robert Gates. Here on page 430, he says that his skillful management of the Pentagon made me willing to overlook those times he tried to manage me as well, and he wasn't afraid to take on the Defense Department's sacred cows, including efforts to rein in the defense budget. And so the guy who's been part of the State Department for like 30 years, including part of the Bush administration, really just has no problem taking on orthodoxy and wants to fundamentally reform the State Department, not the State Department, the Defense Department, and including by cuts to it. Like we have to cut military spending. We're spending $700 billion a year on the military, more than the next, Obama said, like 30 nations combined. Right now, I think it's like 12 nations combined. We got to take on their cash cows. Okay, let's move forward 6 pages. Here he says, throughout the debate, Gates was quick to ascribe any objections Rahm or Biden might raise about the difficulty in rounding up the votes in Congress for the $30 to $40 billion a year in additional spending that McChrystal's plan might require, or the wariness of the nation might feel or close after close to a decade of war as mere politics. So anyways, here 6 pages later, the reformist, cash cow budget cutting cows and budgets, Robert Gates is now in support of giving an additional $40 billion a year to the military when McChrystal asked for it. And so it's almost as if he was part of the system the whole time, and Obama, wanting to brand himself as a reformer while also a realist, is now ascribing those same characteristics to the Bush administration entrenched bureaucrats, which he decided to appoint as head of the biggest military in the history of the earth. Okay, so Obama's about to win the Nobel Prize, and so he has to, again, he's the war president. He was the war president a few pages ago, but now he's also the peace president. And so he, it's 11 years later, war in Afghanistan is still going. A lot of people say it's a disaster, but including Obama. Obama knew that it would be a disaster if we stayed there this whole time. And because, again, he plays both sides of every issue despite being the commander-in-chief of the army and the policy that he's now criticizing. What does that mean exactly? I'd sometimes say shortly that we keep doubling down on bad decisions we've already made. Does anyone think that spinning our wheels in Afghanistan for another 10 years will impress our allies or strike fear in our enemies? So Obama's like, this is gonna, why are we, we shouldn't be committing to this long-term quagmire, which probably isn't going to result in anything positive and is just going to be a huge expense, going to lose a bunch of lives, and when we leave 20, 30, however long, a decade later, it will be in the same situation. Well, here I am 11 years later reading Obama's book, and he's exactly right. We're in pretty much the exact same situation. The Taliban still controls vast swaths of Afghanistan. The government's corrupt, and it's said that the U.S. isn't allowed to pull out or else the government will collapse, and there is no timetable for withdrawal, and it's been 11 years. And so now the war is 19 years old, which means that there are people fighting in Afghanistan right now who weren't alive when the war started or weren't alive on September 11th. And so Obama's totally right. And for that type of skepticism, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He says, "You were just awarded the Nobel Peace Prize," Gibbs says. "What do you mean? They announced it just a few minutes ago." "For what?" Obama asks. That's a good question. It is a good question. He absolutely shouldn't have won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he got it for not being Bush, despite putting Bush's people back in office and continuing Bush's war. He still won the Nobel. It's actually an impressive, just like getting elected with the support of the establishment and a movement was impressive. Winning the Nobel Peace Prize while having support of the war hawks who got us into all these wars, and keeping the peace movement kind of on your side is an impressive balancing act that Obama should be applauded for if that's the kind of things that you're impressed by. And so Obama's about to accept the Peace Prize, and he's going to use it as a platform to fight for his values and his calls for action. So he says, "I saw the prize as a call for action, a means for the Nobel Committee to give momentum to the causes for which American leadership was vital." See, this is what American leadership is fighting for, and Obama especially. Reducing the threats of nuclear weapons and climate change. So nuclear weapons, climate change, the threats have been reduced. I just saw a thing, the bulletin of atomic scientists who have a doomsday clock, which is calculated principally on the risk of nuclear war as well as global annihilation for other threats, like climate change, and then also of recent authoritarianism. It's now closer to midnight than it's been at any time since, I think, 1954 or maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's because the threat of nuclear proliferation has expanded, principally because because of the long-standing policies which Obama defended, namely not criticizing Israel's having of nuclear weapons, continuing to, bang the war drum all over the world as we have bases in every country around the world, bombing countries everywhere, and not fundamentally challenging the global order, which is to the benefit of the United States, but does make things unstable when people don't want to go along with that and do things like build up their own military as a deterrent, or want to pursue their own weapons, as in the case of Iran and North Korea, so that they're not invaded like Iraq was, or like Libya was, which is going to happen a little bit later, which Libya was invaded. When that happened, Libya had been convinced Gaddafi had been convinced prior not to pursue nuclear weapons, and then as a result, when he was able to be invaded and overthrown by the U.S. In, I think, 2011, and actually, when Trump was negotiating with North Korea and South Korea about getting nuclear nonproliferation there, John Brennan, who Trump put as his national security advisor, who's a total war hawk from the Bush administration, tried to undermine that. And one of the things he said to undermine the negotiations to get rid of weapons there was that he thinks that North Korea should follow the Libya model. The Libya model being Libya gets rid of their nuclear weapons. And it was very clear to the North Koreans and anybody paying attention that the U.S. pushing for the Libya model in North Korea would lead to a lack of a deterrent there, and the same fate for the North Korean government as potentially the same fate as what happened to Gaddafi, which is not in their interest, which means that the risk of nuclear annihilation is large. And so far as the U.S. goes around overthrowing governments like Obama did, that is what caused things like nuclear weapons and nuclear nonproliferation to be not a success and to have expanded further, and the trends of authoritarianism that we're now living through with, Trump was elected, he just got unelected, but the right wing is still extremely strong, and as are right wing populist movements, or even neo-Nazi movements in Europe, in terms of Hungary and Poland, and the rise of the National Front and Marie Le Pen in France, and what is that called? UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party in UK, and Brexit, and the forces of disintegration are very strong. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. In Brazil, you have Bolsonaro, like a very strong right-wing current of exploding all of the things that Obama says that he cares about are continuing because of the policies of the Obama administration. Climate change, I won't talk about climate change too much here. Obama was better on climate change, especially during his last couple of years. But there's also videos of Obama talking about how we're going to drill especially during his first term, we're going to drill everywhere and we're not apologizing for it. And we've built so many pipes that it could circle the globe. And so we're drilling all over the place.
Under my administration, America is producing more oil today than at any time in the last 8 years. That's important to know. Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. So we are drilling all over the place.
And he was a big supporter of fracking, and so was Biden up to this day. And he expanded that around the world with the help of Hillary Clinton and a number of other things. And so, the U.S.'s carbon footprint was not any smaller under the Obama administration, and he again was able to shut the environmentalists up, just like he's able to shut the anti-war movement up by saying flowery words here and there, including in this book now, in order to maintain their support while really not doing much to help it. And so he's talking about these reducing the threats of nuclear weapons, climate change, shrinking economic inequality. Is this a joke right now? Did Obama do anything to shrink economic inequality? It proliferated substantially under Obama. And I'm right now, during the pandemic, I think overall wealth for households diminished to a very large extent for the poor and middle class, while at the same time, I think the richest 100 billionaires made $700 billion during the first few months of the pandemic, including Jeff Bezos. I remember one day he made how much you make? He made like on the order of $20 billion in a day or something. It's like inequality has not been addressed at all because you have been defending these people and you just bailed out Wall Street. But he's like, okay, yeah, upholding human rights. Yeah, that's human rights have been upheld. It's like Obama wants to uphold human rights, except for when there's conflicts with U.S. interests, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, any of our allies, anywhere. Which means that like if you talk out of one side of your mouth to all of your allies, which says, we don't like that you're chopping off people's hands and crucifying them for being sorcerers, but here's all this money. Like, they can understand that. That's not a threat to them. But then there's actually countries which are in opposition to the U.S., some of which are human rights violators, like Cuba or Iran or North Korea. They'll criticize them, or Russia, China to a certain extent. But that's only because it's leverage in negotiations with them, and they are economically in opposition to us and for various things, and they're not kind of accommodating to themselves to U.S. hegemony, and so they can be criticized. But it's like you don't have any authority or any like you don't have any, I don't know, you know the word I'm thinking of, any credibility when you do it that way. And you also make no success. And so the things that Obama's talking about in his Nobel speech, you can talk about in a Nobel speech, but the other 363 days of the year, you're president and you can do something about him. He doesn't want to do anything about him because he wants to be a popular president that keeps getting elected and keeps getting donations and support from Wall Street and everything else, while also getting credit for making Nobel speeches like this. And so that's what Obama really cares about. And it was, under any metric, this was absolutely not a success. Bridging the racial, ethnic, and religious divides. Oh, the racial divide, it was like, it's not like Black Lives Matter started under a black president and a black attorney general under your watch because you didn't do anything to substantially impact the criminal justice system, prison reforms, anything like that. He did a tiny bit during his last year. But again, it's just tinkering around the edges because he wants to be viewed as one of the figures of history. And to do that, you don't take on the powerful people who write history and who, bring you to power. So Obama is visiting, I think, a hospital with some soldiers who are injured in Afghanistan there, as he does quite a few times. And it's interesting that when he did that, he always let the press know that he was doing that. So we'd go to like midnight salutes for it's like, if you're actually doing that, then like, why do you need the press there? Why are you telling them this? Well, you do it because it's a public. It's like, if you actually care about that stuff, would you need to tell the press about it? It's kind of like donating to, like, if you're going to donate charity, you're going to be like, guys, I just donated. It's like that Seinfeld episode where like George puts his money in the tip jar and but the guy doesn't see, so he like tries to take it out. He like puts a 20 in, then he like takes it out, and the guy like thinks that he's stealing from him. He's like, no, I was just trying to like get it so you saw it. And that's what Obama, and it works. The press eats it up. But he's like, okay, so he's visiting these ones here. I mean, maybe actually, I assume to a certain extent he does care, but again, this is a image thing as well. So he runs into, I could remember from the entire visit, were one of those soldiers' mothers. Don't leave those boys who are still over there hanging, she said. She looked exhausted, her face howled with grief. I promised I wouldn't, not knowing whether that meant sending more soldiers to finish the mission for which her son had made the ultimate sacrifice, or winding down a muddled and lengthy conflict that would cut short the lives of other people's children. It was left for me to decide. Well, I mean, he decided, like, that we're still in Afghanistan right now, and it's been 11 years. I mean, you just got the Nobel Peace Prize, but you can't just go around ending wars willy-nilly. Like, that would be irresponsible. And so then Obama makes his decision, and he's going to expand the troop presence in Afghanistan, but he's going to do it responsibly. And so he says his plan, it forced us to refine America's strategic objectives in Afghanistan in a way that prevented mission creep. Here we are 11 years later. I don't know what the mission is in Afghanistan to like not totally have lost everything. It's like we keep fighting. It's like, okay, Taliban has 50% of Afghanistan. Let's try to get that down to 30. Oh, they're back up to 45. Let's try to get that back down to this. Oh, we just lost this guy in this government. Let's try to get it back. It's like constant. It's like this is the mission right now in Afghanistan. Nobody knows what the mission is in Afghanistan. Originally, it was to get Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. Nobody even claims that that's what it's there for anymore. And so if mission creep didn't happen, I don't know what happened. It's like, clearly mission creep crept, and so Obama's plan was a total failure. But he still had to say it in this book as if we don't know that the war is still going. And so Obama's about to give his Nobel speech here, and he says, with the help of Ben Rhodes and Samantha Power, I wrote a first draft drawing on writings of thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr and Ghandi to organize my argument that war is both terrible and sometimes necessary, that reconciling these seemingly contradictory ideas requires a community of nations to evolve to higher standards for both the justification and the conduct of war. And so Obama is like, he is continuing these wars as the head of the U.S. empire in the spirit of Gandhi. So he's picked out a couple people who have actually credibility here, and he's like, look, Gandhi wasn't an actual literal pacifist and thought that there were certain instances where war could be justified. Therefore, all these wars which the U.S. is doing, which is by definition for the highest reasons because we are exceptional in that way, and our value of human rights and bettering liberalism and freedoms around the world trumps everything for us. Therefore, we are acting in the spirit of Gandhi. And of course, Samantha Power is the one that would write this, because of course she is, because Samantha Power has made a career of justifying wars while crocodile tearing, atrocities and massacres that our adversaries did, like in Eastern Europe, or in Kosovo, or anywhere that like the U.S. is in opposition to a massacre, you're allowed to oppose it. This is manufacturing consent 101 in terms of if there's a massacre in Cambodia, or there's a massacre in Russia or Eastern Europe or China at some points, or it's done by the Viet Cong, like you're allowed to talk about those. And in fact, they will be talked about endlessly as the only ones around the world, because doing so, undermines, public opinion globally for those other countries or organizations, and B, like makes us look like we are the ones in support of human rights. Now, if there's a massacre in East Timor or in Iraq, like I remember I watched a debate with Samantha Powers and Jeremy Scahills where they were talking about A Problem from Hell, which is like one of her books about like the problem of genocide and stuff. And she was like talking about this, and Jeremy Scahills was like, okay, well, let's talk about what happened in Iraq during the 1990s. There was hundreds of thousands of people that were killed and died in hospitals because of the U.S. sanctions that the Clinton administration put forward, which Madeleine Albright and others talked about openly, knowing that they would kill hundreds of thousands of people. Samantha Power was like, no, we don't want to talk about that. That one doesn't count. I don't think that one counts.
In response to some of what Samantha was saying, in the 1990s, the worst humanitarian crises in the world, certainly Rwanda and other African nations, certainly in Europe, but Iraq. I mean, where is the label of genocide for the U.S. policy toward Iraq? It was Bill Clinton who initiated the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam against Iraq under the guise of humanitarian intervention in the north and south of that country. The sanctions killing hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, we have had one of the greatest mass slaughters in history, in modern history, in Iraq, going from 1990 to the present, and yet everyone talks about this as though it's not genocide, as though it's not part of that bigger picture. Clinton selling weapons to the Turks to slaughter the Kurds. I mean, there were all sorts of horrific things happening in the world, and it's the selectivity of U.S. foreign policy that I think is really outrageous. It's not that no one should do anything about it. It's that the Iraqis, it's sort of, good victims, bad victims.
Samantha Power.
Where does one start? I mean, I would just like to know, I guess, or just ask the question is, since you've spent so much time there, at the moment that we're at now, what do we do, in fact? I mean, are you suggesting that then basically the Kosovo should become part of Serbia? I mean, I felt like we hit a stalemate and something had to budge. There was going to be violence in Kosovo, and I don't mean to brush all the crimes of American foreign policy under the rug, and I've written extensively also about sanctions and the toll of sanctions and so forth in Iraq, but just to
but
stick
is that genocide,
to stick to this moment, no, but we can talk about that. I don't think the Clinton administration set out to deliberately destroy the Iraqi people as such.
Oh, I totally disagree, but what Madeleine Albright said, it was worth the price, the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi victims.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Because of course she doesn't think it counts, because you don't get to being an advisor to the president, the Nobel Prize award accepting president, unless you understand how the game is played and you crocodile tears for those people, but not these people, the ones that you could actually affect. I think she's repugnant. But she would be the perfect person to write this speech for Obama, because this is exactly the narrative that he tries to put forward as he assassinates people that he just picks out of the lineup during his Terror Tuesday meetings, literally just Terror Tuesday meetings, we are going to decide which people to blow up. And there was a leak, I might have mentioned this earlier, but this is an 8-hour video, you probably didn't even watch it, of during a 6-month period of what percentage of the people that Obama killed in his drone programs were civilians. It was over 80%. 80% of the people that were killed were civilians. Many of the people, they don't even know who they are. They're just they just have a cell phone and have, like, you know, a certain algorithm pops out like this person might be a terrorist. They don't even know the name of them. And then once the drones are hits, every single person that's killed that's a military age male is presumed to be a terrorist. So they just count everybody as terrorists, and thereby reduces the civilian numbers. But this is Obama's war, and he knows this. He's not going to write about it, but, like, he knows all this. Samantha Power knows all this, but that's not what she does. She freaking cries and you know, writes her books on genocides while supporting everything that the U.S. does, and but thereby is the perfect person to write this speech for Obama during his Nobel acceptance, which is ridiculous that he even won it. So my cholesterol is already through the roof, and my blood pressure is spiked from all the cheese I've consumed from Obama thus far, but this one might just put me over the top, so let's hope I can get through the video after reading this. But he's this is like he's justifying war while completing his Nobel speech, and so the circus act to pull this together needs to have a bow on it of the cheesy inspirational chapter ending, which he's known for. So he says, each person, this is at the end of his speech, each person held aloft a single lit candle, the city's traditional way to express its appreciation for that year's Peace Prize winner. It was a magical sight, as if the pool of stars had descended from the sky, and as Michelle and I leaned out to wave, the night air brisk on our cheeks, the crowd cheering wildly, I couldn't help but think about the daily fighting that continued to consume Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the cruelty and suffering and injustice that my administration had barely even begun to deal with. So it's like, it's not that his administration is causing it. He just hasn't dealt with it yet. This is Obama's fault that he's not able to fix everything which he didn't cause, that other people caused, but he's just trying his best to fix as much as he can. The idea that I or any one person could bring order to such chaos seemed laughable on some level. The crowds below were cheering an illusion, and yet, in the flickering of those candles, I saw something else. I saw an expression of the spirit of millions of people around the world. The U.S. soldier manning a post in Kandahar, the mother in Iran teaching her daughter to read, the Russian pro-democracy actor at Fist muttering his courage for an upcoming demonstration, mustering his courage, all those who refused to give up on the idea that life could be better and that whatever the risk and hardships, they had to play a role. Whatever you do won't be enough, I heard their voices say. Try anyways. Okay, chapter ends. I've gave my thoughts on this, but this is just total nonsense. Obama starts talking about how he went about doing the hard work of rehabilitating the U.S.'s image around the world after the Bush administration had diminished it with their, over-the-top militarism and so on and so forth. Obama's got to rehabilitate it. So he's like, I did the hard work. I chose the smartest diplomats. They had lots of talks with people. And me personally, I even went to other countries and I had town halls where I lectured the starry-eyed, idealistic youth about the importance of democracy and never giving up on your dreams, and that's really what changed things. So he says, the young people that I met in those town halls were a steady source of personal inspiration. They made me laugh and sometimes made me tear up. In their idealism, they reminded me of the youthful organizers and volunteers who had propelled me into the presidency. And so he's like, yeah, no, this is my bread and butter. I'm, at heart, a starry-eyed idealist that just happens to be the president. Now I'm lecturing these people. This is what Obama loves to do, lecture youth about idealism. And then he says, this is, this, and then, the smart people and the change in tone, which I provided, that changed the world. So he says, around the world, public attitudes towards the United States had steadily improved since I had taken office, demonstrating that our early diplomatic work was paying off. I think that's extremely unlikely that they increased throughout Obama's presidency because, he just talked about getting the Nobel Prize. That was right at the start of his presidency, which is a reflection of global public opinion. They just gave you a peace prize before you did anything. He didn't even make any major foreign policy decisions. This was before he decided even to expand the war in Afghanistan. He literally hadn't done anything with foreign policy except for reappoint George Bush's Secretary of Defense. So he's like, what could they possibly have given him the peace prize for? He even acknowledged this. So what did I do? other than the change in style. There was nothing of substance there. And that's a reflection of global public opinion, too. Like when he went to Germany as a Obama the candidate, over 100,000 people saw him in Germany. And that was the same trend around the world because he was a much prettier, younger, different, more polished face of America than as a representative of America than was Dick Cheney, who was like the head of the Bush administration. And so that change led to a change in public opinion, just like it led to, worldwide, just like it led to a change in public opinion in the U.S., which led to Obama getting elected. But like, was there anything of substance there? Like, I don't know really what it would be. And so then Obama starts talking about Iran, and to his credit, like he puts the history here of the U.S. intervention in Iran and U.S. policy and how it led to the current situation, and it's mostly accurate. Just like his rendition of what happened in the Philippines was mostly accurate. And I'm sure if you asked him about the war in Vietnam, he would give the correct figures in terms of casualties and the timeline. And the Philippines, you could do the same thing, or Nicaragua or Guatemala if you were to push him, or the Iraq War. Like Obama understands what the U.S. does. It's just that he understands it, and then he continues to believe that the U.S. is the shining city on the hill with motivations that are pure, despite these occasional admirations, which despite the fact that there is literally tens of millions of people that died from him, more than any other country in the world. That's just an exception, which is awfully inconvenient if you're going to continue the same policies and the belief in American exceptionalism, which led to these massacres during your own administration. And thereby you can play the role of somebody who doesn't change anything and continues things as normal, and thereby gets the support of the establishment, while also trying to get credit for being somebody who understands things at a different level than these these old cold warriors who went against America's pure ideals of human rights and democracy. And so then he goes through the history of Iran. He says that in the 1940s and 50s, it was generally viewed as just another poor Middle Eastern country. Its territory shrunk by civil conflict and ascendant European powers. In 1951, though, Iran's secular left-leaning parliament moved to nationalize the country's oil fields, seizing control of profits that had once gone to the British government, which owned a majority stake in Iran's biggest oil production and export company. Unhappy to be boxed out, the Brits imposed a naval blockade to prevent Iran from shipping oil to would-be buyers. They also convinced the Eisenhower administration that the new Iranian government was tilting towards the Soviets, leading the Eisenhower to greenlight Operation Ajax, a CIA MI6 engineered coup that deposed Iran's democratically elected prime minister and consolidated power in the hands of the country's young monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. So Obama's, he puts it in there. He's like, I'll just add the democratically elected prime minister, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He was also like liberal in terms of he supported human rights and freedoms in Iran and the Middle East to an extent that the Shah certainly didn't, and the current administration absolutely doesn't, and most of the other U.S. allies in the Middle East don't. And he was democratically elected. So this was a democracy that was, for liberalism and human rights and the ideals that America claims to have as its guiding beacon for its foreign policy. And Obama recognizes right here that as soon as he tried to nationalize the oil or cut into the profits of Western oil companies, in this case, what was the predecessor to BP, British Petroleum, the U.S. came in with Britain and immediately overthrew him and then supported a dictator. So Obama's like, oh yeah, no, it's right here. He still, maintains throughout the rest of the book that this is just an exception, despite, mentioning or not mentioning the dozens of other exceptions that happened throughout the U.S.'s, history of imperialism. But he puts it in here. So then Obama has to explain how this could have happened. And so he talks about it. He says, Operation Ajax had set a pattern for U.S. miscalculation. So it was just a big miscalculation in dealing with developed countries that lasted throughout the Cold War. And so there was just this short, 50-year period during the height of U.S. power that we were just constantly miscalculating. And so we miscalculated in Iran, we miscalculated in Guatemala, we miscalculated in Chile, we miscalculated in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and the Philippines and East Timor and all these a lot of miscalculation, but and it was because we were mistaking nationalist aspirations for communist plots, equating commercial interests with national security, subverting democratically elected governments and aligning ourselves with autocrats when we determined it was to our benefit. That was a huge mistake. We didn't want to just align ourselves with autocrats when it was to our to our benefit. the people that we're talking about being the shapers of U.S. policy and the special interests in the oil companies and the like that Obama had talked about in the previous paragraph, they were just making a mistake. So if they had known that there wasn't really any communist plots, or they'd thought a little bit more about it, then they would have realized that, okay, we're going to lose money when these countries nationalize their own resources and try to empower their own populations instead of letting their resources be exploited by Western corporations. But, because our ideals are so high, we're happy to lose out on that money. No, this was like from the beginning, like this was U.S. foreign policy worked exactly as it was supposed to, and it continued in more or less the same exact way after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union crumbled. And the only thing that changed was the justification for the armed interventions and the propping up of dictators in the 1990s and in the 2000s, which shows that the whole Cold War wasn't just a big grand mistake. Like mistakes like that don't happen decade after decade after decade in one direction that just happens to help the same wealthy people which are crafting U.S. foreign policy. But Obama, by saying this, Obama allows himself to acknowledge that there were mistakes made, which his Nobel Peace Prize supporting left-wing activist base, might not have supported things like the coup, things like wars, while also still maintaining the facade of America having higher ideals, which allows him to continue the interventions which are to the transparent benefit of the same special interests as happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s throughout the 2010s while Obama is overseeing the empire. And remember what he said about how we made mistakes about aligning ourselves with autocrats when we determined it was to our benefit. And it was like, okay, the Arab Spring's about to happen, and Obama's about to twist himself into a pretzel for a few dozen pages, explaining why he has to maintain all these alignments with autocrats when it's to our benefit. And so then Obama starts talking about the Iran nuclear agreement. And let me just preface this by saying the single best thing that he did during his presidency was the Iran nuclear agreement, which was during his second administration. But still, in talking about that very issue here, he twists the facts so much that it causes me to have long-winded responses that nobody wants to listen to that go on for minutes and minutes to what are really just 4 sentences in a small passage here. But I have no choice but to do that. So he says, an Iranian nuclear arsenal wouldn't need to threaten the U.S. homeland. Just the possibility of a nuclear strike or nuclear terrorism in the Middle East would severely limit a future U.S. president's options to check Iranian aggression towards its neighbors. The Saudis would likely react by pursuing their own rival Sunni bomb, triggering a nuclear arms race in the world's most volatile region. Meanwhile, Israel, reportedly holding a trove of undeclared nuclear weapons itself, viewed a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat and was allegedly drawing up plans for a preemptive strike against Iran's facilities. Any action, reaction, or miscalculation by any of these parties could plunge the Middle East and the United States into yet another conflict at a time when we still had 180,000 highly exposed troops along Iran's borders, and when any big spike in oil prices could send the world economy deeper into a tailspin. So he kind of gives away the game at the end there when he's like, okay, oil prices could spike. That would be a big problem. That's like the fundamental reason for all U.S. foreign policy. Like, would we be propping up a monarch in Saudi Arabia that chops people's heads off for sorcery if they didn't have the most oil supplies in the world? Like, no, we would not be doing that. If Iraq's chief export was asparagus, would we have invaded Iraq? No, we would not have invaded Iraq if that was the case. And same with everything. He actually acknowledges it when he was talking about the coup in 1954. He's like, yeah, they were going to try to nationalize, the oil supplies there, and that wasn't good for BP, and so we came in and overthrew their government. And then he says, and then here too, like, we can't have oil supplies, like, that chain can't be tampered with. And prior to that, Obama talked about Iran can't get a weapon because if they do, then there would be proliferation throughout the region. There would be a nuclear arms race, and Saudi Arabia might want one, and then other countries, and that can't be good in a destabilized region. So we can't allow them to have it. And Israel especially doesn't want one. And Israel, which has a trove of undeclared nuclear weapons itself, might have to attack this other country for trying to get nuclear weapons. So Israel, which has attacked and invaded its neighbors, I don't know, probably like a dozen times or something since its inception, which was only like 70 years ago. It's attacked Lebanon like 4 times, Egypt multiple times, Jordan, like the West Bank and Gaza, if you're counting that, many, many times. They're constantly invading and bombing and attacking people, and they have a bunch of illegal nuclear weapons, which they're not allowed to have under international law, because countries aren't allowed to just start, under the Non-Proliferation Agreement, aren't allowed to just start making nuclear weapons because they want them. If you do that, then the whole world is going to explode, because if there's any miscalculation in any country, then boom goes the dynamite. But Israel can, and we're going to continue to give them billions of dollars each year in military aid, so that they can, occupy Gaza and the West Bank and invade their neighbors and destabilize the region with their nuclear weapons, which are highly provocative, which Obama doesn't mention in the case of Israel because, again, he's kind of got to kowtow to U.S. foreign policy interests and the establishment here, and you don't criticize Israel like that. But with Iran, he acknowledged that if they were to even get one, like, that would totally destabilize the region. Israel's attacked countries, like I said, over and over and over again, and they'll probably do it within, maybe by the time I'm done reading this next sentence, they do it whenever they want to. But Iran hasn't attacked a country, I think, since like the 17th century or the 18th century at the earliest. It's been over a century since Iran has attacked another country. Like, they've been attacked. They were attacked by Iran by Iraq and Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, when the U.S. was giving aid to Saddam Hussein for his attack on Iran. Because, again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If that's a Saddam Hussein, or if that's, whoever it is that continues the current paradigm in the Middle East, that's just fine. But, like, so the idea that Iran is, Iran is the rogue state, when in reality, by every metric, Israel is the rogue state, which is destabilizing the Middle East to a much greater extent than Iran. And whatever you say about the Ayatollahs or the leadership in Iran, they're not suicidal. They've, constantly, in fact, they made the nuclear agreement with Iran with Obama later on, but they don't want, they're a little bit kooky in the head with their religious ideas and this and that, and the laws in Iran aren't great, but they are very comparable to the U.S. allies in the region. But they don't want to lose their own power, and so the reason that they're pursuing a nuclear weapon is because it's a deterrent. It's because once you have a nuclear weapon, it's much less likely that you'll be overthrown by the United States or Israel, which are constantly provoking and saying that they're going to invade you, and just invaded and destroyed your neighbor. And so it's a very real threat. And so in order to deter that, what you do is you pursue a nuclear weapon, which would stop a ground invasion of Iran, in the same way that a nuclear weapon in North Korea would stop an invasion of North Korea and an overthrow of the regime there. Actually, I think I mentioned this earlier, but you probably didn't see it because nobody's watching this whole thing. But when John Bolton was trying to undermine the Trump administration when they were negotiating with North Korea for disarmament, he said that the North Korea should follow the Libyan model. And the Libyan model was that Gaddafi did not pursue nuclear weapons. And then, as is about to happen in 50 pages here, Obama decided to overthrow the regime in Libya and take out Gaddafi. And so what Bolton was saying is they should pursue the Libyan model so that we can overthrow and invade them whenever we want to, because they won't have a deterrent. And that was saying to North Korea, hey, you better go after this nuclear weapon. And John Bolton was trying to blow up the nuclear agreement because he's a giant war hawk, and doesn't want anything that could lead to peace. But he was right in that instance. A nuclear weapon is a deterrent. And Obama even kind of acknowledged it. He says that it would severely limit a future president's options to check Iranian. He has to phrase it as Iranian aggression. Again, Iran. There's no reason to think Iran would invade another, one of its border countries or attack Israel. Like, the idea that Iran would attack Israel out of the blue with a nuclear weapon is totally insane. Like, if one country is going to be attacked, it's going to be, from the other. It's going to be Iran from Israel. In fact, I think Israel just a couple of weeks ago just assassinated Iran's top nuclear scientist, in the same way that the Trump administration at the start of the year killed Soleimani, the top general of the kibbutz forces, the military in Iran. And so it's the U.S. that's assassinating their top people. Iran is assassinating their top people. They're both constantly invading and destroying Iran's neighbors. Obama mentioned it here, but we have thousands of people on Iraq's border, in this case because the Iraq war was still going on. But also we have like a dozen bases directly on Iran's border. I'll put that on the screen now. But it's like, imagine if the roles were reversed. If Iran was constantly invading, destroying countries, they first went to Canada and then to Mexico and Colombia and this and that. They are constantly saying, we're going to attack the United States, and they have a military that's exponentially larger than ours. Would the United States just like cross our fingers that the hawks in Iran don't decide to, because out of the niceness of their heart or whatever it is, don't decide to invade? Or would they try to get something which is a deterrent? Like, that everybody, like all the strategic analysts, everybody understands that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it's a deterrent, and it limits the U.S. and Israel's options in a potential invasion of Iran, and thereby stops the potential for a regime change, which is what the U.S. is really afraid of. And so this whole narrative is totally wrong. Like, Iran is not the rogue state. They're kind of run by, religious lunatics in the same way that the rest of the Middle East is. But it's the U.S. and Israel that's constantly undermining the prospects for peace or nuclear nonproliferation or anything. And Obama knows this because there's little things, if you read between the lines here, where he acknowledges it. Like, trove of undeclared nuclear weapons itself. For Israel, they're going to take action against. We have all these things on the border. You could disrupt oil prices. Like, if you read between the lines and you know how to read it just right, you can see what's happening here. But this is just 1/3 of one page in his 700-page book, and most people aren't into stuff like this, and nobody's listening to me right now anyway. A few pages later, Obama starts talking about Russia and what happened after the wall fell there in the Soviet Union, and he says that if the turmoil that engulfed Russia in the 1990s, economic collapse, unfettered corruption, right-wing populism, shadowy oligarchs, gave me pause. It gives him pause. So he's like, nevertheless, I held out hope that a more just, prosperous, and free Russia would emerge from the inevitably difficult transition to free markets and representative government. So he's like, this is going to be inevitably, again, it's like just like with the Iran a few pages ago, it was like a miscalculation. Like, this was inevitable that like you're going to transition to markets. There's going to be some growing pains. He acknowledged earlier in the book that the people that were pushing the opening of all these markets and the deregulation in Russia were Larry Summers and Tim Geithner. And Rob Rubin and the people in the Clinton administration, the same people that he put in his administration, he acknowledged earlier in the book, were the reason for the collapse in Russia. Now it's just inevitable part of the difficult transition to free markets and representative. So he's like, this is just inevitable. And so it's like, again, awfully convenient that, this had to happen, and the people that were pushing it are the same people that I put in power that have been pushing things for a long time. But, I still had an optimism that I held out hope that a more prosperous and free Russia. So if everything, even though the people that are actually shaping the things are corrupt, oligarchs, trying to benefit Western corporations, and they're the same people in my administration, I still held out hope about it. And so then Obama starts complaining about how Russia and Putin keep blocking U.S. initiatives to further human rights. And so he says that when U.S.-backed initiatives came before the Security Council, he made sure that Russia blocked them or watered them down, particularly anything touching on human rights. And so it's not fair. Like, Obama and the U.S., our goal is to export human rights around the world, and we do our best. That's the reason we have to have the biggest military in the world and American exceptionalism. We're different. We want to expand human rights. These other countries are trying to undermine human rights, especially Russia. It's making our job tough as we try to shape the world in an idealistic utopia where nobody exploits anybody and human rights predominate. And in reality, like, the U.S. has blocked more Security Council initiatives than I think any other country. Like, the U.S. and Russia, go back and forth as 1 and 2, but like pretty much anytime there's a war, there's a U.S. Security Council. There's an initiative in the Security Council to condemn it, and the U.S. vetoes it. Or anytime there's a call for a settlement in Israel-Palestine, there's a vote in the Security Council, and the U.S. vetoes it. Or anytime the U.S. overthrows a dictator, or not a dictator, overthrows a democratically elected government and institutes a dictator, as in the case of Iran or Guatemala or Indonesia or Chile or any country you can mention, there's usually a Security Council initiative condemning it, and the U.S. vetoes it. And so what really happens is that because the U.S. is like kind of in tension with Russia, they'll call out what Russia does, and when Russia does the exact same thing as the U.S., in the Ukraine or in Jordan or whatever it is, then the U.S. will say like they're blocking human rights. But when in reality, whenever there's human rights violations that benefit the U.S., they have nothing to say about it. But again, Obama wants to paint himself as the opposite of Putin rather than just the kind of like his equivalent in the West. And then Obama has his talk with Putin, and Putin like goes into a long diatribe about all his complaints with U.S. foreign policy. Uh-oh, that's an omen. Oh my God, there's like 12 crows above me. Can I see that? It's freaking. So anyways, here's what he says. He says that, he liked Bush personally, Putin did, and reached out after 9/11, pledging solidarity and offering to share intelligence in the fight against a common enemy. He'd helped the United States secure air bases in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan for the Afghan campaign. He'd even offered Russia's help in handling Saddam Hussein. And where had it gotten him? Rather than heed his warnings, he said, Bush had gone ahead and invaded Iraq, destabilizing the entire Middle East. The U.S. decision 7 years earlier to pull out of the anti-ballistic missiles treaty and his plans to house military defense systems on Russia's borders continued to be a source of strategic instability. The admission of former Warsaw Pact countries into NATO during both the Clinton and Bush administrations has steadily encroached on Russia's sphere of influence, quote unquote, while U.S. support for the color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan under the specious guise of democracy promotion had turned Russia's once friendly neighbors into a government hostile to Moscow. As far as Putin was concerned, the Americans had been arrogant, dismissive, and unwilling to treat Russia as an equal partner, and constantly trying to dictate terms to the rest of the world, all of which, he said, made it hard to be optimistic about the future of relations. And so that's what Putin said. Obama acknowledges a couple things, so then he talks to him more. He's like, okay, there's this and that point. You have a little bit of a point, but mostly Obama had to play hardball with Putin, and he just disagree with him, and he had to stand up to the dictator that's against human rights. In reality, everything that Obama listed here is absolutely true. What he says about Iraq is true. What he says about the admission of former Warsaw Pact countries into NATO is totally true. And if the shoe was on the other foot and Russia, let's say Mexico and Canada and all of Central and South America were joining the Warsaw Pact, or the equivalent of NATO, if there was still a Warsaw Pact, which was allying itself with with Russia, which was the enemy of the U.S. or someone that the U.S. was hostile with, in the same way that when the shoe was on the other foot, it's the same way for Russia. Then there would be a problem. If people know what the Monroe Doctrine is, that was like 100 years ago, and it said that U.S. gets to control every country in the hemisphere, and if anybody steps out of line, that's a problem. So attack against the U.S.'s sphere of influence is attack against the U.S. And the U.S.'s sphere. Take a note where all these hostilities are happening. Like Ukraine is a flashpoint, Georgia is a flashpoint. Like with China, stuff is happening in the South China Sea. The stuff that's happening, which is a problem for the U.S., is happening right on the borders of the other major powers. And they're not happening on the U.S. borders. And so the U.S. has military bases all around these countries and is expanding its sphere of influence, as these countries join NATO and do the exact things that he talked about, despite the fact that that Bush and his administration had promised Gorbachev, when he allowed the wall to fall in East Germany, that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, in terms of we're going to allow this to happen, but you're not going to be allowed to totally incur upon Russia's interest in its neighboring countries. What happened was, just like Obama said, the U.S. expanded all the way to the point where NATO was right now on Russia's doorstep, and that continued throughout the Obama administration. Let's see. And then he pulled out of the ballistic missiles treaty. Yes, no, this is absolutely true. And it kind of illustrates that the U.S. is the one that's mostly undermining global stability. And it's not surprising, because the U.S. is much more powerful in this relationship. I think Russia's GDP is less than Italy's. But this is all true. But Obama puts it here, but then he goes on to be like, okay, then I had to talk tough with Putin and let him know. So page 472 is kind of interesting, because Obama is trying to get the UN to take actions against Iran for their nuclear program, and Obama just received this highly classified, important intelligence report on Iran's nuclear program, that they're building a facility near the ancient city of Qom, and he's like, oh, this is a bombshell. I need to tell the other people at the UN so that they can increase the sanctions. So the first thing he does is he tells the Russians, and without going on too much of a tangent, I'd like people to think about what the reaction from, let's say, MSNBC would be if it was found out that, Trump was leaking highly classified information to the Russians. It would be very different than this reaction, which was No reaction at all, or just applause from the media, because because they like Obama, and B, because in this instance the leaks were to the benefit of U.S. power, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So he tells the Russians, he's like, okay, we need to increase the sanctions, and then he's like, instead we gave the story to the New York Times just before the G20 leaders were scheduled to meet in Pittsburgh. So next thing he does is he leaks this highly classified information to the New York Times, and he writes about it in his biography here, and there's no comment on it. There's no comment from anybody on it, even though the Obama administration itself prosecuted more whistleblowers for leaking classified information than any president in history. And actually more people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act under Obama for leaks of classified information than every other president combined. And this is the same person that is ordering leaks of highly classified information. Now, the difference between let's say a Chelsea Manning, who was prosecuted and imprisoned for years and years and put in solitary confinement under Obama for leaking information to WikiLeaks about war crimes, was that the crimes that Manning leaked were not helpful for the government and not helpful for power. So it's not helpful to know that the U.S. is, shooting down journalists, Reuters journalists and civilians from a Black Hawk helicopter in Iraq. That doesn't really help the administration. Now, this does help the administration because it helps increase tensions with Iran and garner support for the sanctions which Obama is trying to press for. And so in this case, there's no comment at all. And then the other difference or distinction is also obvious, which is that the Obama administration, Obama's the president. So he is the person in power. Who's going to hold him into account? Is anybody who's going to take on the president? Nobody's going to take on the president. Now, if it's Chelsea Manning, if it's Bill Binney, if it's any of these other leakers that leak information which is unhelpful for the president, you can throw them in prison, and there won't hardly be any outcry at all from the press. But in this case, classified information, and also Washington leaks like a sieve. Like, there are leaks all the time. In fact, whenever you read the New York Times or the Washington Post and it says a senior administration official said or something like that, most of the time that's classified information, and it's just fine because the Post, like that, those people are insiders. The reporters who reported on that are insiders. The administration officials are insiders, so it's totally fine, and there's going to be no prosecution. If it's let's say Julian Assange or somebody else that's leaking to directly to the public, they're outsiders. They have to be prosecuted. They're not being helpful at the moment. And so the Obama administration leaks all the time. He's going to talk about the raid on Osama bin Laden. Pretty much all the information, that was a really classified raid, but all of the information about that raid was like leaked immediately. Like the name of the special dog that was on the helicopter, like all the details of the mission, highly classified information immediately leaked to the press because it was helpful. It was like this is helpful American-y information. People want to know about the Tom Clancy novel that Obama just pulled off, which increased his approval ratings by like 8% overnight. That's good information to leak. So page 473, Obama has an anecdote about how just over the top the Chinese are with their spying of U.S. officials at these international gatherings. And so he says, occasionally the brazenness of Chinese intelligence verged on comedy. And then he goes on to tell a story about how one U.S. official left his hotel room and then came back, and there was like Chinese officials with a maid spying through or going through his diplomatic papers. And Obama kind of just shrugs that off, and he's like, yeah, we have to do business with them. This is just how it is. It's kind of funny because the Obama administration literally got caught tapping the phones of Angela Merkel as well as other world leaders. That was one of the revelations of the Snowden leaks, which again is a big contrast to the leaking. This is unhelpful leaking that the U.S. is spying on world leaders. Now, if China leaking, like Obama will write about that in his book, but that leaking, that's the type of thing that will get you exiled in Russia for years and years and try to be prosecuted for the rest of your life and thrown in solitary confinement. Not helpful. The type of leaking that he just did one page earlier to the New York Times about the Iran nuclear facility, that's just business as usual. That we can tell the public. But this other stuff that all the shady things that we're doing, that is kind of a thorn in the side, and we're not going to talk about that. We're going to prosecute that. Page 474 is apparently the complaint about China part of the book, and so Obama says here about China, It helped to obscure how systematically China kept evading, bending, or breaking just about every agreed-upon rule of international commerce during its quote-unquote peaceful rise. For years, it had used state subsidies as well as currency manipulation and trade dumping to artificially depress the price of its exports and undercut manufacturing operations in the United States. So he's like, China is just, we're playing by the rules and China is breaking all these rules. And they're using state subsidies to prop up their industry. This is a guy that just, a couple chapters ago was talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars that the state spent under his orders and his advisors' orders, Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, to bail out the largest banks in the U.S. If that's not a subsidy, what is a subsidy? The U.S. spends the military budget, the $700+ billion that the U.S. spends on the military each year. Most of that is a state subsidy to Raytheon, Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing. There's a bank called the Import-Export Bank, which is also known as the Bank of Boeing, which is a government-run institution, which essentially subsidizes U.S. industry, predominantly Boeing, so that they compete more competitively with international competition. Exactly what China is doing. Like the corporate tax rate, extremely low. The effective corporate tax rate, extremely low for corporations. There's offshore havens. They don't we all know that the corporations have get a much better deal than do the citizenry. Like Amazon paid $0 in tax a couple of years ago. Is that a state subsidy? They also have like a $600 million CIA contract to run their cloud operations. Is that a state subsidy? Like there's a ton of different state subsidies that happen all the time. Like the U.S. spends tons of money on research in universities and at NIH and government-funded subsidized research. And when there comes out a pharmaceutical, breakthrough or a new technology, what happens is that becomes privatized, and then that money goes towards private corporations. And so even with things like the iPhone, I think every single major piece of technology was developed by the state. I mean, then they were put together by Apple, and so they added to it also. But GPS, that's a state subsidy. The GPS was started by the Navy, I believe. Even I think touch screens were developed by the U.S. Transistors. I'm not a technology guy, but I believe that every major piece of technology within the iPhone was originally developed at places like MIT and Bell Laboratories. And then eventually they become, same with computers in general, the internet. Like these are giant state subsidies, which are the public is paying for, and then eventually the profits become privatized to corporations, U.S. corporations. And so the state subsidies for the U.S. are off the charts, but Obama isn't going to mention them because his job is to defend U.S. corporations while complaining about China, because it's more of just a kind of tug of war and a power dynamic as to how much what's going to benefit U.S. corporations the most. And right now, complaining about China is the way to go. He goes on. He starts complaining about how China is stealing intellectual property from U.S. companies, and it's just not fair. He's like, the big mean man China is bullying not only Uncle Sam but also his good friend Mr. Walmart, and I don't think that's right. He's bullying the poor Walton family, stealing their intellectual property, or Apple or whatever it is. He says that embargoes, it also engaged in the theft of U.S. intellectual property and placed constant pressure on U.S. companies doing business in China to surrender key technologies to help speed up China's ascent up the global supply chain. So the way he's putting it here is that they just had no choice. They choose to do business in China, and China has certain laws or standards or things that they expect from companies doing operations there. It's not labor standards, it's not environmental standards, and that's the reason they were attracted there instead of to the U.S., these U.S. companies. But the other part was that they're going to be China has a different system that developed under Deng Xiaoping, where pretty much the companies that the Chinese companies are quasi-private, but also still part of the state and run by the state. And in order to develop rapidly, as China's done over the past few decades, one of the things that they've had as a prerequisite for doing operations there is that if you want to do work here, then we're going to get access to your technology. And this is something that whatever you say about U.S. corporations, they're not stupid. They didn't just get swindled for 30 years. They knew exactly what the deal was. It's just now that as China's developing and as some of the companies which is developed in China, which are again quasi-state run, are competing with the major companies in the U.S. There's the only country which has real competitors to Facebook, Google, in the major tech companies in the U.S., Apple, is China. They've developed Huawei. They've developed. I had to get WeChat because I was thinking of doing some stuff in China. They have actual competitors for U.S. companies there because of this system. And the U.S. companies knew that this was going to come down the pike, but in the short term, the big profits from having Foxconn factories paying people 20 cents an hour to assemble their iPhones was just too good of a deal. But now the U.S. is coming in and acting like they're getting swindled. This is exactly what they knew was happening the whole time. And so Obama's, again, he's fighting for his team, and his team is U.S. corporations. But this is pretty dishonest. And so the next page, Obama starts strawmanning unions again, something that he likes to do. Again, Obama, he doesn't attack many people, but he'll get his jabs in on unions and environmentalists and the anti-war. Like he'll get his jabs in for sure. And he says, my own views on China didn't fit neatly into any camp. I didn't share my union supporters' instinctive opposition to free trade. So the unions just instinctively oppose free trade. Like, what is free trade? Like there's free trade, like the idea, like free trade is you say that and it polls well in the same way that support our troops, polls well. But like, what does it mean? Like, it's kind of a hollow phrase that is used to, like in the latter instance, to suppress dissent about the war. And so you're like, you don't support our troops, you don't support the war. Well, another way to support our troops would be to not have them blow up in wars for oil and U.S. hegemony that really result in the development of you don't support our troops. It's a way to subvert dissent while using a poll-tested, like, vacuous, empty phrase for that. And free trade is kind of the same in terms of free trade. Like the free trade he's talking about is like the TPP, which was the free trade agreement which he pushed for, or free trade agreements like permanent normal trade relations with China, or the or NAFTA. Like these were, he never did anything to undermine it. He continued, like, this is the free trade that Obama's talking about. Things like that. Like those trade agreements have provisions in them that are just 100% corporate giveaways. They're written by corporate lawyers in empty rooms with very little, if any, union or labor representation there, and then they're negotiated in secret in the dark and then shoved through Congress without public consent. Like, people don't know what's in these trade. One thing that was in, I think it was in the TPP, but or it's in NAFTA as well. There's provisions in there that say that you can that corporations can sue governments for environmental or labor law also, I believe, but certainly environmental law, which would threaten the future profits of those corporations. And so if we have, let's say Hershey's in Bolivia exploiting water there, and they Bolivia and like polluting in the waterways and everything. And Bolivia passes a law that to a Clean Water Act or something like that. Hershey's can now sue Bolivia, the government, because they're costing them their profit. This is what the free trade agreements are. And so that's the type of opposition that unions have to free trade, or having to be like, okay, free trade, I guess that means that this corporation can now go, manufacture and pay people 50 cents an hour rather than $20 an hour. And then they can sell that back into the U.S. without having any tariffs or anything at all. And so there's totally undermines U.S. wages and leads to the poverty and depression and rise of right-wing authoritarianism, which we saw with Trump in places like the Rust Belt, and total disillusionment with the political system as corporations spike their profits, at the same time exploiting labor, pretty much screwing over the workers of the world and also putting them at each other's throats when really it's the corporations that are exploiting it. That's the problem that they have with the free trade agreements. But Obama just characterized it as free trade in a way that makes it seem like they're Luddite, backwards, people who just don't understand the economy, when in reality they're trying to better it for the middle class and for help workers. But Obama is just going to go ahead and strawman them right there. He also didn't, and I didn't believe that we could fully reverse globalization, like as if anybody is arguing for fully reversing globalization. As in, like, part of globalization is, now you can, like, travel. You used to not be able to travel anywhere, and, now people are able to travel all over the world. Or, there's globalization in terms of, like, cultural influences, are now, like, nobody knew what was happening in Africa 500 years ago here, or vice versa, or this and that. Now that internet, like, there's 100 different things of globalization. Nobody says you're going to reverse all of it. The part that he's talking about is just U.S. corporations going over there and exploiting labor to make as much money as possible. Like that, we can't really do anything about. If they want to exploit labor over here, destroy the environment over there, and then just sell all their stuff back into the U.S. to make tons of profits and utilize our markets while destroying the environment and the world and exploiting labor over there. Like, we can't say. Now, he's not going to say that. He's just going to he's going to strawman it as, I didn't share my union supporters' instinctive opposition to free trade, and I didn't believe we could fully reverse globalization. Nobody's arguing that at all. But Obama, he can't just say, I think that we just need to prop up U.S. corporations and do massive giveaways to them all the time while screwing over workers, and I don't really care about the third world at all or environmental standards globally, because that would be kind of a tough political fight to have. So he writes just garbage sentences like this, which are total straw men and totally inaccurate, in order to slyly jab at unions, which, again, supported him, but probably shouldn't have in retrospect. So Obama really enjoys blaming unions for not doing progressive things, and so right here he says, he's talking about climate change. He says, still, key democratic interest groups, especially the big industrial unions, resisted any environmental measures that might threaten jobs for their members. So he's like, these unions, they're always out here undermining the environmental work that I want to do. In reality, yes, there is some tension between unions and environmentalists on certain issues. For example, if you were to shut down all of the coal-fired power plants and then all of the coal miners went out of work, that would be something that the coal miners' unions would oppose. On the other hand, any real environmentalist or all the major environmental groups, the Green New Deal, it all calls for what's called a just transition, which means that as jobs are lost in the extractive industries of the past that were, around fossil fuels like coal mining, then that would mean that as we transition towards solar power, towards high-speed rail, towards wind power, towards retrofitting the buildings in the U.S., which is one of the biggest reasons for climate change, is the inefficiency of heating in our buildings. This is work that requires a huge amount of resources and a huge amount of labor, which could be to the benefit of unions and working people. In fact, would be to the benefit to them in the same way that the massive industrialization of World War II after Pearl Harbor was to the benefit of working people. And so there really isn't a tension there, but it's that type of legislation Obama never supported. And it's important for him to, again, paint unions as not only Luddites that are in opposition to, free trade or, want a total reverse, want to totally undermine globalization, is what he characterized them as last chapter, but also they're, not environmentalists. So I got to take on these interest groups. In reality, union membership has been declining for the past 30 years, and the corporations have a much stronger hold on Democratic Party politics, as the trade deals and tax cuts of the Clinton administration and the bailouts of the Wall Street bailouts of the Obama administration show. But still, he needs to get jabs in on them as he can, while also explaining why he didn't do environmental things and blaming them for it. So it's really a win-win for Obama to attack the unions, but it's not really accurate. And this next page, Obama lays out his triangulation and his lack of principles regarding the environment, but you can extrapolate to his general political philosophy right here for the world to see. And so he says, he's talking about his environmental policy when he first came into office, and he says, and in a nod to the political center, I promised in all of the above energy policy that would allow for the continued development of domestic oil and gas production as America transitioned to clean energy, as well as funding for ethanol, which is a total sham. The amount of money that goes towards, ethanol is the most, again, I was talking about, because I'm the only one here, state subsidies earlier on. One huge amount of state subsidies goes towards agriculture, into the giant agro businesses, specifically towards corn subsidies. And one of the biggest grifts was ethanol, which is totally inefficient. I think you use almost as much money almost as much oil in creating the ethanol as the energy that the ethanol actually has, and it's totally uneconomical if it wasn't subsidized massively by the government. So he's like, oh yeah, ethanol, clean coal technology. Again, clean coal is a total grift also. There is no such thing as clean coal. Coal is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. Getting it from extremely, extremely dirty to just extremely dirty does not make it clean. But calling it clean coal does get you some political capital and allows you to triangulate with Republicans and centrists while supporting fossil fuel industries and not getting attacked as much from environmentalists. And nuclear power. Nuclear power is another long tangent. I'm not supportive of nuclear power. I think in the long run it's probably the worst energy, but in the short term you kind of do need nuclear power in order to take away some of the some of the load capacity of our current grid while transitioning towards renewable energies. But he's like, okay, so all of the above. So he's like, okay, this is my energy policy. Like, I want to do environmental stuff, but we also need to make sure that we're continuing to do everything. So if you're doing everything, you're doing nothing. Like, at the end of the day, a ton of carbon is still a ton of carbon, whether it comes from clean coal or regular coal, or fracked oil from America during a recession that we need to make sure we're making jobs fracking in Pennsylvania and Ohio, or domestic oil production that's off the shore. Later it's going to come back to bite them in the butt as the BP oil spill destroys the entire Louisiana coast. But he's like, okay, yeah, I know we need to do everything. You're not doing anything if you're doing everything. And he says, my happy talk about a painless shift to a carbon-free future prompted grumbling from some climate change activists. They hope to hear me issue a call for a bigger sacrifice and harder choices, including a moratorium or outright ban on oil or gas drilling in order to confront an existential threat. Obama says, in a perfectly rational world, that might have made sense. So he's like, in a rational world, maybe, but in the actual and highly irrational world of American politics, which I am the center of, I'm the center of the irrational world of American politics. My staff and I were pretty sure that having me pay in a doomsday scenario was a bad electoral strategy. So he's like, in the rational world, this doomsday scenario is the rational actual world. But in the politics world, which I'm the head of, then we don't want to scare people. So we're gonna tell them that we could easily transition while I do nothing at all. He did do a little bit of stuff, but mostly I just subsidized giant corporations and rebranded dirty technologies with my hope and change message and shut the environmentalists up, as we didn't really do anything. And also, again, another caricature when he says that environmentalists hope to hear a call for bigger sacrifices and harder choices. The harder choices were not for like people to stop driving cars. The harder choices was for the U.S. to invest in green technologies and solar energy and battery storage technologies and high-speed transit, which Obama talked about earlier in the book as being one of his promises for the Recovery Act, which actually we don't have any high-speed rail in the U.S., so we obviously didn't do that. So that's what the environmentalists were calling for, was kind of a Green New Deal, but 10 years earlier, so it wouldn't have had to be as expensive, and the threat wasn't as existential, and the political dynamics were better because it wasn't during a Trump administration. It was after the Hope and Change progressive was elected with huge support from everybody to change things and do things on the environment. But as Obama says, in the actual and highly irrational world of American politics, Obama's world, my staff and I were pretty sure that painting a doomsday scenario was a bad electoral strategy. So he's like, we're not, we can't do it. He says, we won't be doing anything to protect the environment. Floof barked when questioned by a group of activists, if we lose Ohio and Pennsylvania. And so he's like, sorry, if we're going to have to, frack in Ohio and Pennsylvania and continue with all these irrational policies just because I think it's good for my electoral strategy. In reality, his vote share diminished from 2016 to 2012, and the Democrats were obliterated over the 8 years of the Obama administration and lost 1,000 seats across the country, and led to Trump getting elected with the support of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin in the next election, because nothing substantially changed and there was no real paradigm shift in American politics, and this was a part of it. And so in the long term, it was actually a terrible electoral strategy. But again, Obama's constituency that he was appealing to was the corporations, the special interests, and the establishment as it was, rather than to the activists or the hope of idealism that had propelled him to victory, but it was mostly just a charade. And so this is a revealing passage, in my opinion. So here on page 504, Obama, the idealist, makes a quick return, and he starts opining about how much he wishes that things were different when he was elected, because presumably if things had happened differently in the 90s, then he wouldn't have to be talking about clean coal and fracking all over the place, and drilling off the Gulf of Mexico and all over the U.S. coastline, and subsidizing ethanol, which is a total sham, and all these other things which are terrible for the environment. He wouldn't have to do them if we could just review the history and change it. He says, I sometimes imagine a parallel universe which the United States, without rival, immediately following the end of the Cold War, had put its immense power and authority behind the climate change fight. I imagine the transformation of the world's energy grid and the reduction in greenhouse gases that might have been achieved. This is what he's, imagine, like, if only there was a way. I personally imagine what would have happened if Obama had started doing stuff on climate change, 10 years ago when he had a chance and a giant majority to do stuff and didn't, expand fracking. And as he said in his speech in Cushing, Oklahoma, we're drilling all over the place and we have enough oil pipeline to, circle the earth.
We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. So we are drilling all over the place.
He's like bragging about how much, because again, he wants to have it every way. He wants support from the fossil fuel industry and the environmentalists. But like at the end of the day, you cannot have support. Like if the carbon's out there, it's out there. So you can't do both things. It's like you can't. He's like, I want support from the war, the anti-war activists, and I want support from the military. Well, if you have a war, the war is still going on. Doesn't matter how flowery your speech is or how pure your soul is deep down. What matters is your actions. And so he somehow wants to maintain support from every single interest group that there is. And when that happens, he ends up pivoting back to what had been happening before, and then giving big long speeches like this. He continues imagining here. He says, I imagine the transformation of the world's energy grid and the reduction in greenhouse gases that might have been achieved, the geopolitical benefits that would have flowed from weakening the grip of petrodollars and the autocracies supported by these dollars. So he's like these I don't want it, but these regimes are supported by petrodollars, and that the autocracies are there because of petrodollars. In reality, petrodollars strengthen the U.S. because petrodollars are when oil is bought from Saudi Arabia or any country on the international market, they have to be bought in dollars. Those are petrodollars. So that boosts the U.S. dollars because there's a huge demand for dollars so that they can buy the oil there. So that boosts the U.S. and then the U.S. props up those countries. And so petrodollars are a benefit to the U.S., not vice versa. And then the U.S., as thanks for that, gives them, buys the oil and then also gives them huge amounts of money for weapons, or buys or sells them weapons to the tune of, I think, $100 billion Obama sold during his last term to Saudi Arabia. And so that's what it is with petrodollars. It's not that petrodollars aren't something that the U.S. wants that are supporting them. It's that petrodollars help the U.S. and the U.S. helps in kind to these autocracies. And so really this whole chapter is Obama complaining about how environmentalists and environmental groups are just being really unfair to him, and they just don't understand how it is in the real world, that they're blaming him for the expansion of fracking or the rebranding of clean coal or of the giant subsidies to ethanol producers, which are just giveaways to the oil companies and big agribusiness, or offshore oil drilling, or the expansion of pipelines around the world, and not taking position on the Keystone pipeline, the tar sands, which is the dirtiest form of energy, and really not doing anything on the environment. His position is it's not fair. He says more specifically it would be viewed as my failure. It's not fair, said Carol. Like this is, bam, smallest violin for the President of the United States, getting unfairly attacked by environmental groups who don't understand that, even though in the real world, we need to keep the carbon out of the atmosphere, in Obama's political world, we need to give away a bunch of secessions to the fossil fuel industry. His view is like, okay, it doesn't matter what the facts are or what the science is. If the fossil fuel industries and the Koch brothers are pulling for this and environmentalists are pulling for this, I'm going to need to meet them somewhere in the middle here, even though the science says that if we're going to save the coastlines and the planet from destruction, then we need to do this. This is politics, so we're going to have to give some stuff away here, and I'm just going to point myself as a victim. And so this whole chapter, Obama's pretty much explaining why the do-nothing agreement that he agreed to in Copenhagen and fought for, which was actually less than what other countries were asking for, which was the Kyoto Protocol type agreement, and to fight for the U.S. to ratify it, which Obama said, sorry, we can't, or I can't do that, but instead here's this lesser agreement, and now he's unfairly getting blamed. It's not fair. They're blaming me, these environmentalists, for my lack of action. And then the pity party kind of comes to an end here. He says, I realize that for all the power inherent in the seat I now occupied, there would always be a chasm between what I knew should be done to achieve a better world and what in a day or a week or a year I found myself actually able to accomplish, which is maybe true to an extent that, even a powerful seat like the presidency, you can't do everything that you want. But what the moral person would actually do, or Obama, the idealist, would do, if he actually was an idealist that wanted to fight for these things, the activist Obama would fight as much as he can and push it as much as he can, and if he came up short, then that would be something. Instead, what he does is triangulates and gives away the house to the oil, gas accompanies the Republicans and everything else, and then just has a pity party for himself when he didn't even really try, because politically it wasn't like that actual fighting, that's not in his best interest politically. But again, this is Obama has to do this, or else he would have to take account for his lack of action on climate change as well as the other issues during his presidency.